250 years ago, in rural Cheshire, in the parish of Coppenhall, the residents of the little hamlet of Monk's Coppenhall were in a bit of a lather. A resident who was around at the time left us this account. "In our lane, where there have not been 2 coaches seen before these 12 years, now 3 or 4 pass in a day, and the poor come by cartloads." But what on earth was the reason for this sudden activity? Our chronicler explains. "Old Bridget Bostock hath in her lifetime made it her business to cure her neighbours of sore legs and other disorders, but her reputation seems now so wonderfully to increase that people come to her from far and near." Bridget Bostock's newfound fame was due to an article about her healing powers in the Gentleman's Magazine in 1748. The effect on Monk's Coppenhall was remarkable. So many people of fashion now come to her that several of the poor country people make a comfortable subsistence by holding their horses. We jump forward now 80 years or so. Bridget Bostock is part of local folklore. The grandsons of those who knew her work the land, and their wives and daughters make cheese, some of the best in Cheshire, it's said. But destiny has another plan for this dot on the landscape, one that would change it forever. But it could have been so very different. The success of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which opened in September 1830, had sparked railway mania. In February 1831, a bill came before Parliament to establish a cheap, certain and expeditious communication between the important manufacturing towns of Birmingham and Wolverhampton, the iron manufactories and mining districts of Staffordshire, the salt works of Cheshire and the port of Liverpool. It was, as we would say today, a no-brainer, or so you might think. George Stephenson, chief engineer for the proposed line, had planned to take it through Nantwich, where the Shropshire Union Canal provided the means of bringing in raw materials. But it wasn't that straightforward, as Stephenson's biographer reveals. He called upon some of the landowners in Nantwich to obtain their assent, and was greatly disgusted to learn that the agents of the canal companies had been before him. They had described the locomotive to the farmers as a most frightful machine, emitting a breath as poisonous as the fabled dragon of old, and telling them that if a bird flew over the district where one of these engines passed, it would inevitably drop down dead. The canal's representatives had done their work well, and the local landowners refused to allow the railroad to pass through Nantwich. Stevenson received a similar rebuttal in Winsford, and came, almost in desperation, to Coppenhall, where he was better received. The line was completed in 1837 and opened on the 4th of July. One of the supporters of the railway was the Earl of Crewe, and a brand new station now stood in fields near to the family's ancestral home of Crewe Hall. The tiny community that existed here was called Crewe, and the station was therefore known as Crewe Station. In 1840, a line from Chester to Crewe was completed, and 2 years later, a more direct line from here to Manchester. Amalgamation of the lines created the giant Grand Junction Railway Company. Within 20 years, Crewe lay at the junction of 6 railway lines. Change at Crewe became a common phrase among Victorian travellers, but the biggest changes were taking place in Bridget Bostock's old haunt, Monk's Coppenhall. In its first year of operation, the Grand Junction Company suffered more than 100 major locomotive failures, which convinced the directors to take responsibility for building and maintaining their own engines. Chief Engineer Joseph Locke was charged with building a brand new railway works, and chose a location at the midpoint on the main line. The company bought 30 acres of meadowland at Oak Farm in Monk's Coppenhall, about half a mile to the north of Crewe Station. In the summer of 1841, gangs of labourers and builders moved in to turn ancient pasture land into engine sheds and homes for workers and their families. The core of this new railway colony was Prince Albert Street, named after Queen Victoria's husband. The railway works were in Forge Street, and the first residential streets were Crewe Street, and Manchester and Liverpool streets, which disappeared under later development. Moss Square was named after the chairman of the company, John Moss, and at the heart of the burgeoning community was Christ Church, also built by the railway company. The colony grew rapidly as the engine works expanded, pulling in workers from Lancashire, the Midlands, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. To cater for the needs of the growing community, the company built shops, a market hall, laid on gas and water supplies, and provided schools and health care. One of the few facilities they refused to provide was pubs. If the railwaymen wanted a pint after work, they had to go to the neighbouring village of Church Coppenhall. The company had relented by 1850 and later even bought the Crewe Arms next to the station. The company also kept a close eye on the behaviour of their workers when they were off duty. An inspector was employed with the power to dismiss any workman who permitted his family to live in a disreputable manner. But not all of the facilities laid on by the company were up to scratch, it seems. Water was pumped from Valley Brook to standpipes in the streets, and in 1856 a report tells us, "The water is execrable and muddy, and the taps are sometimes blocked with fish and other creatures." From the start, the railway company was the dominating feature of local government. By the 1860s, though, things were changing. The last houses provided by the company were these villas in Victoria Street, built in 1859, especially for foremen and their families. From now on, any new homes were constructed by a variety of small private developers, mainly in the West End, after the railway steelworks were built beyond Flag Lane. When these terraces were built, many families still kept a pig or two, and the plans included a pigsty in the backyard. With the railway company's paternal influence beginning to wane, conditions in some parts of town deteriorated. This is an extract from a health report on one street in 1867. John Cooper occupies number 5. 11 people reside here. Number 6 is occupied by Mary Sladen. 12 persons live here, often more. Jane Ockleshaw inhabits number 7, and she has a family of 7 and a lot of lodgers. John Holland lives at number 9. 13 persons stop here, in addition to a donkey in the kitchen. The privies and back premises are in the most wretched and filthy condition. I would advise that proceedings should be taken against the owner for allowing such filthy places to be inhabited. Neighbouring Church Coppenhall also has some problems. Many people had to walk 2 miles to fetch water, and in the search for new supplies, a borehole was sunk at Cross Green. Although the water was salty and polluted with sewage, it was considered usable for household purposes. A pump was fitted and a new but wholly unsatisfactory supply obtained. So began the extraordinary affair of the Coppenhall Spa. Local entrepreneur Henry Platt was convinced that Cross Green water was the equivalent of the famed Harrogate water in its curative properties. A number of experts agreed, encouraged by the lord of the manor, Mr. Edelston, and concluded that the hydrogen sulfide in the water was the result of interaction with moss. In fact, it was due to the infiltration of raw sewage. Even so, in no time at all, vast numbers were visiting the site. On Good Friday, 1877, more than 400 people came for the water. Rather surprisingly, there were no reports of adverse effects. Henry Platt had bigger plans and advertised for developers to join him. Church Coppenhall, with its salubrious air and its spa, offers excellent opportunities for expansion. But interest soon dwindled, and it would be some years before the builders moved into Church Coppenhall. Even today, a large part of the old township remains undeveloped. While the Cross Green Spa was a flash in the pan, the region's main industry was booming. This account shows one aspect of the railway's success. Crewe is, for travelling post office purposes, by far the most important junction in the kingdom. Indeed, there is nothing like it in this respect in the whole world. Within 3 hours, between 11:30 at night and 2:30 in the morning, not fewer than 14 mail trains, each with sorting carriages attached, arrive and depart from this station. Meanwhile, the growth of the railway town at Monk's Coppenhall continued. A population that had stood at 200 in 1841, by 1871 was approaching 40,000, and it was still expanding rapidly. Much of it bore little resemblance to the original hamlet, and although it was still officially called Monk's Coppenhall, it was more commonly referred to as Crewe, after the station. At a public meeting in October 1875, a resolution was passed requesting a charter of incorporation for the town of Crewe. It was granted 2 years later, and in June 1877, the first elected council, comprising 18 councillors and 6 aldermen, took over local government. The town of Crewe now existed officially, but this caused something of a conundrum. The town was named after the station, but the station lay outside the boundary of the town. An often quoted local riddle described this unusual state of affairs. The place which is Crewe is not Crewe, and the place which is not Crewe is Crewe. The situation wasn't rectified until 1936, when boundary changes finally included the station within the town. But there was another muddle unaddressed. There was, of course, another place called Crewe, predating both station and town, the old hamlet around Crewe Hall. Very confusing, particularly for outsiders. This was addressed in 1974, when the name of the older settlement was changed to Crewe Green. "1887 marked the 50th anniversary of the opening of the station that started it all. By a happy coincidence, it was also 50 years since Queen Victoria came to the throne. To mark the occasion, the railway company decided to provide the town with a brand new park. A new service road was built and named Victoria Avenue in honour of the Queen, and the park, Queen's Park, was officially opened in June 1888. It was described like this: "The new pleasure park, with its beautiful trees and shrubs, artificial water, and other objects of a recreative and pleasing character, render this a favourite and popular resort for the inhabitants." When Queen Victoria died in 1901, the people of Crewe joined in the national mourning, perhaps a little more emotionally than most towns, because, as the Crewe Almanac pointed out, the town of Crewe has known no other monarch. By now, the population of Crewe was approaching 50,000, and in some respects the town was outgrowing itself. For almost the first time in its history, the spectre of unemployment raised its head, and the first employment exchange opened here in 1912. Ironically, it took the outbreak of World War I to solve the problem. Within days of Britain entering the war on the 4th of August 1914, nearly 400 Army and Navy reservists had left Crewe. 2 battalions of the Cheshire Artillery Brigade, made up entirely of Crewe men, were in training in a field off Victoria Avenue. Excursion trains were cancelled as troop trains took precedent, and soldiers passing through wandered around town waiting for their connecting train. The people of Crewe were in no doubt there was a war on, and everybody lent a hand to help the war effort, from the townsfolk who helped with the requisition of horses for the Crewe artillery batteries to the women who formed knitting clubs and fundraising committees. The war also brought an unexpected benefit. The railway works became busy again, making shell cases, gun carriage parts, machinery for locomotive repair shops in France, and 2 armoured trains for use along the east coast. Soon the works employed more than 10,000 people, an all-time high. Many local men joined the Cheshire Regiment and were in action in France and Belgium from early in the war. They were heavily involved in the Battle of the Somme, and 20 men from Crewe died on the very first day, on the 1st of July 1916. Among the town's many tragic losses were twin brothers Henry and John Villiers-Russell of 17 Audley Street. They worked as labourers at the railway works and were also members of the St John's Ambulance Brigade. The local brigade was attached to the Royal Navy's Sick Berth Reserve, and during the 1914 works holiday, the brothers and 2 workmates, James Burnell and Albert Kinley, spent a week's training on HMS Formidable. War was declared on their 2nd day aboard, and they volunteered to stay with the ship. Five months later, they were all dead. In the early hours of January the 1st, 1915, Formidable was sunk in the English Channel by a German U-boat. 547 crew were lost, including the Villiers-Russell boys. They became one of the few sets of twins lost in the same incident during the war. Their bodies were washed up at Lyme Regis 22 hours after the sinking. They were brought back to Crewe by train and buried at St Michael's Church in Coppenhall. Thousands of people lined the streets to the church to pay their respects to the brothers who made the ultimate sacrifice for king and country. The bodies of their workmates were never found. The end of the war in November 1918 brought jubilation to Crewe. The streets were soon thronged with thousands of men, women and children, many displaying tricolour ribbons. Even horses and dogs were decorated with rosettes and ribbons. There were more subdued scenes in Market Square on the 14th of June 1924, when a sombre crowd gathered for the unveiling of a memorial to the town's fallen. In his address, General Sir Ian Hamilton told the hushed audience, "Unless something entirely unprecedented enters quickly into the hearts of mankind, the orphans we are now bringing up will, in their turn, go to war as if it were a game, and find it, as we found it, a grave." As we will see, his words proved sadly prophetic. But first, Crewe had some more celebrations to take care of. 1927 marked 50 years since the town was incorporated. Crewe had come of age, and it was entirely appropriate that the mayor in Jubilee year was James Pemberton, the first mayor to be born and bred in Crewe. Local schoolchildren, though, were no doubt more interested in the free boxes of chocolates given to each one of them. A more permanent monument to this landmark for the town was the creation of Jubilee Gardens in Hightown. In the 1930s, in an effort to end Crewe's total reliance on the railway, the council launched a campaign to attract new industry to the town. It all amounted to nothing. The meagre interest that was shown was put off by an age-old problem: the region's poor water supply. The town still received its water from the railway company's source at Whitmore via the old and leaking company pipes. The situation was finally addressed in 1937, when a scheme was devised for creating an independent supply. This involved 2 boreholes at Eton, with a reservoir at Gorsty Hill, and it served the town until it was superseded by the River Dee scheme. The delivery of decent water removed the major obstacle to attracting new business, although it took the threat of another conflict to provide the final push. By 1938, Sir Ian Hamilton's words 14 years earlier were proving ominously accurate. Britain began to prepare for war. It was obvious that much of the combat would take place in the air, and the government called for an increase in the production of Merlin engines. They were used in Hurricane and Spitfire fighters and Lancaster bombers, and made at the Rolls Royce factory in Derby, which was already at full capacity. In May 1938, the Air Ministry reached an agreement with Rolls Royce to finance a shadow factory in Crewe. Construction began on 60 acres of potato fields at Merrill's farm in July 1938, and the first engines rolled off the production line 5 months later. At its peak, the factory employed 10,000 people, many of them bussed in from Stoke and other neighbouring towns. This wasn't an ideal situation, and work began on a new estate within walking distance of the engine plant. Totties Hall was converted into flats for Air Ministry staff, and the first workers' houses in Frank Webb Avenue were ready for occupation by 1939. While Rolls-Royce was manufacturing aero engines, the railway works also turned to war production, making shell cases, gun carriage axles, and parts for tanks. It was obvious that Crewe's industries would make it a target for enemy bombers, and the town prepared to defend itself, although the residents don't appear to have taken the threat particularly seriously. When the expected air raids and gas attacks didn't materialize, people began to relax. There was even talk of the phony war. Once the novelty wore off, the endless gas mask drills became a little tedious. And an appeal for 1,500 air raid precaution wardens produced only 3/4 of that number. Even the council were apathetic. When the Home Office issued an order that unexploded bombs should be dealt with by the local authority, Crewe Council sent just 3 men on a course lasting only 1 day. Attitudes changed dramatically in the spring of 1940. By the end of May, the German Blitzkrieg, their lightning war, had seen them sweep through Holland and Belgium and across France. The British expeditionary force that was supposed to stop Hitler in his tracks was pinned down on the beaches of Dunkirk, and the call went out for a flotilla of small ships to rescue them. When Dunkirk evacuees arrived in Crewe, bringing tales of their experience, local people quickly realized that this war was deadly serious. With Hitler's forces massing across the Channel poised to invade, Secretary of State for War Anthony Eden broadcast an appeal for men not of military age or in reserved occupations. Soon had more serious concerns. The first bombs fell on Crewe on the 29th of August 1940, when 5 high-explosive devices hit Bedford Street and damaged 59 houses close to the station. The first civilian deaths were on the 26th of September, when 2 children were killed in Leighton. There were more than 250 brick-built communal air raid shelters in Crewe, and as the raids intensified, many were equipped with toilets. The old baths in Mill Street became a temporary mortuary with 144 coffins ready for use. On Sunday the 29th of December 1940 came Crewe's worst single incident of the war. The Rolls Royce factory was now operating 7 days a week, and the afternoon shift was in full swing. The observer corps on the south coast picked up a lone German plane crossing the Channel. Fighters were scrambled from RAF Biggin Hill, but failed to intercept the raider due to thick cloud. The plane was then tracked by radar all the way to South Cheshire, and at 3 p.m. the authorities in Crewe were informed that a lone bomber was approaching. The warning was not passed on to Rolls Royce officials, and no sirens were sounded. At 3:09 p.m., the German plane, from a height of just 200 feet, released 2 bombs over the Pins Lane factory. 16 workers were killed outright. Another died later of wounds, and more than 60 were injured, and it could so easily have been avoided. When it emerged that the authorities knew of the threat 9 minutes before the attack, enough time to evacuate the factory, it caused outrage. 3,000 workers signed a petition which was sent by the company directors to Lord Beaverbrook, the minister in charge of aircraft production. It was learned later that it was the general rule not to sound the sirens or issue warnings for a lone enemy plane, which wasn't a great deal of comfort for the families of those who died. To their great credit, the Rolls Royce employees refused to be intimidated, and in January and February of 1941 they produced 88 more engines than in the 2 months before the attack. But Crewe was still in the firing line, and 15 people were killed in a raid on the Earl Street district in April 1941. Les Cooper, a local man who was involved in the attack, left us this graphic description of the day an ordinary community faced extraordinary destruction. The screams of the wounded and dying are indescribably terrible as we struggle to rescue people from the blazing inferno. One woman is trapped by a beam with her backside in the fire. The newsagent dying of cancer, but now relieved of his torment. The builder with his wife and pretty daughter killed by the blast. These are my neighbours, and I know them all. By 1944, the war was turning in favour of the Allies. Air raids had claimed the lives of 35 Crewe civilians, but the town had fought back valiantly. By the end of the conflict, the Pym Lane factory had produced more than 28,000 aeroplane engines, which were crucial to the ultimate triumph. When victory in Europe was finally achieved, Crewe celebrated wholeheartedly. The town had played its part, and paid its price. Although the scars would heal, there is a lasting reminder of the war in Crewe today. Christchurch suffered a direct hit during the air raids. Of the original railway church, only the tower and some ruined walls still stand, a poignant symbol of Crewe's darkest days. Another feature of wartime Crewe was, of course, the Rolls Royce factory. With the resumption of peace, the Pym's Lane plant became the sole centre for motorcar manufacture, and for the first time in its history, the company made complete cars. In 1946, the factory produced its first motorcar, the Bentley Mark VI Rolls-Royce Silver Wraith. The Mark VI was the most successful Bentley ever manufactured. Crewe produced more than 5,000 of them, which equalled the total number of Bentleys made in the 20 years before the war. In September 1950, Crewe Railway Works also reached a landmark when the 7,000th locomotive built here was completed. But the winds of change were gaining force, and as the 20th century progressed, the time-worn phrase, "change at Crewe," took on a different meaning. The heart of the railway town was more than a century old, and was ill-equipped to deal with the demands of a changing world. Redevelopment of the town centre began in the mid-1950s and has been going on ever since. Not all of the changes have been welcomed. In 2006, when it was announced that the War Memorial was to be moved from Market Square to a new site outside the municipal buildings, it caused a storm of protest, all to no avail. The town's main industries also faced challenges. Car making here reached a pinnacle in 1955 when the Rolls Royce Silver Cloud became the first car wholly designed, developed and built in Crewe. Later decades would not be so distinguished, and after years of underinvestment in the factory, it was taken over by the Volkswagen Group. As some people pointed out, there was a supreme irony in this development. The reason the factory was here in the first place was in response to the threat posed by Adolf Hitler. Volkswagen means people's car, and the VW company grew from a plan in 1933 to provide German families with a basic vehicle to carry 2 adults and 3 children. The vehicle was designed on the orders of none other than Adolf Hitler. Anyone in Crewe who lived through the war and knew the history of Volkswagen may have raised eyebrows at this latest twist in the tale. Perhaps they were appeased when Volkswagen guaranteed the future of the factory with a £500 million investment. The railway works, meanwhile, were facing their own trials and tribulations. Nationalisation, reprivatisation, takeovers and mergers saw them acquired in 2001 by Canadian engineering company Bombardier. At its height, Crewe Works employed over 20,000 people. By 2005, fewer than 1,000 remained. Much of the site once occupied by the works has been sold off and is now occupied by new homes, a supermarket, a leisure park and a new health centre. The industry that had made Crewe was a shadow of its former self. Almost symbolically, the building that had stood at the heart of the railway colony from its very beginnings had also outlived its usefulness. At Christ Church, after its wartime destruction, services had continued in the Lady Chapel. After the redevelopment of the town centre, though, the congregation of Christ Church had dwindled, and on Sunday the 24th of November 2013, more than 100 people turned up for the final service. It was a sad end to 168 years of ministry at the iconic Crewe landmark. Was it also a requiem for the railway town? Actually, no, because history may be about to repeat itself. This is from the Crewe Guardian in October 2014. Sir David Hickins, chairman of the HS2 project, has announced that Crewe's historic role as a rail hub serving Merseyside, Staffordshire, the rest of the North West and North Wales makes it the natural location as the North West hub for the new high-speed railway. Town Council leader Kevin Hickson told this newspaper that it is great news that Crewe will benefit from the investment and jobs that this national project will bring, and it is only fitting a premier railway town like Crewe should be at the heart of the nation's advanced rail infrastructure. It's estimated that the Crewe HS2 Super Hub will produce 64,000 jobs and will be a catalyst for the regeneration of the area around the station and towards the town centre. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the town, and we will do everything we can to maximise the benefit to the local economy. So, just like old times, eh? The old saying, "change at Crewe," has never been more apt.